Imagine a state, right here in America, actually declaring war on its neighbor over a strip of land. It sounds crazy, but it happened. So today we're going to dig into the strange, almost forgotten conflict where Ohio and Michigan nearly went to war, all because of a mistake on a map. This is the story of the Toledo War.
You know, when you think Ohio versus Michigan, your mind probably jumps straight to college football, right? Massive stadiums and tense games. But their original rivalry, it wasn't about a trophy. We're talking militias, government showdowns, and the White House having to pick a side. Yeah, the bad blood between these two started way before the first touchdown was ever scored.
All right, so let's dive into that original rivalry. We're about to see how a simple surveying mistake kicked off a historical clash that makes any football game look like a friendly scrimmage.
And believe me, this was never just about a line on a map. The Toledo War blew up into a serious political showdown. You've got armed militias staring each other down, a constitutional crisis brewing, and the whole thing landed right on the desk of the President of the United States.
So, how in the world does something like this even start? Well, it wasn't with a bang, but with a blunder. A simple, but huge mistake on a map. Let's take a look at the geographical slip-ups that lit the fuse for this whole thing. And here we go. This is one of the main culprits. The entire problem really started with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which was based on flawed maps just like this one. See, if you look at how they drew Lake Michigan, it's kind of tilted, and its southern tip is way farther north than it is in reality. That one little error on a piece of paper put Ohio and Michigan on a collision course. Okay, so this gets us right to the heart of the disagreement over this 468 square mile chunk of land called the Toledo Strip. Michigan's claim, which they called the Fulton Line, was based on the original letter of the law from 1787. But Ohio, when it became a state in 1803, just redrew the line. They wanted to make sure they got the super valuable mouth of the Maumee River, and that became the Harris Line. So you've got two different lines, one very valuable piece of land, and one major problem. And this problem didn't just get solved. Nope, it got way more complicated. As you can see here, this whole thing just simmered for decades. Then it finally boiled over when two different official surveys came up with two totally different results, one for Ohio and one for Michigan. So now both sides had official-looking documents to back up their claims. This was getting messy.
And that brings us to the fight for Toledo itself. Why was this one little strip of land so critical that both sides were willing to risk an actual armed conflict over it? And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? This wasn't just about pride or bragging rights. This was all about cold, hard economics and who was going to control the future of the entire region.
Here's why it mattered so much. Whoever controlled Toledo controlled the future of business in the area, period. It was a perfect port, a gateway to all the trade on the Great Lakes, and even more important, Ohio had these huge plans to make it the northern end of their massive new canal system. This thing was going to be a vital artery connecting the Ohio River to Lake Erie, and it would let them completely bypass the awful Great Black Swamp. Toledo wasn't just a town, it was the prize.
So with that much on the line, the conflict escalated pretty quickly, from a war of words into a series of very real and honestly sometimes comical standoffs. By 1835, Michigan's governor, this young, fiery guy named Stevens Mason, he'd had enough. He got a law passed called the Pains and Penalties Act. It made it a crime punishable by a huge fine and 5 years of hard labor for anyone in the Toledo Strip to claim they were from Ohio. And Ohio's Governor Lucas, he basically laughed it off, saying, and I quote, "This act of Michigan will be wholly disregarded by Ohio." Tensions were at an absolute boiling point.
And this led to the most famous showdown of the war, the Battle of Phillips Corner. A Michigan militia snuck up on a group of Ohio surveyors. A few shots were fired up in the air, the Ohioans scattered and ran into the woods, and a few got taken prisoner. The only real casualty here was Ohio's pride. It was more of a farce than a fight, but it proved just how serious both sides were taking this.
But, you know, it wasn't all just posturing. There was real violence. A Michigan deputy sheriff actually got stabbed by someone loyal to Ohio. And get this, in a super bold move, Ohio officials snuck into Toledo in the middle of the night just to hold a court session and prove it was their territory. They then got spooked by a false alarm and fled in a panic, leaving their bar tab unpaid at the local tavern. You can't make this stuff up.
In the end, this bizarre conflict wasn't settled on any battlefield. It was decided by political power plays all the way in Washington, D.C., leading to what would be called a frostbitten compromise.
And to be fair, both sides had a pretty decent case. Michigan was sticking to the letter of the law, right? The original Northwest Ordinance. Ohio argued, hey, Congress never challenged our claim back in 1803, the original maps were a mess, and besides we're a powerful, established state. So they both felt they were in the right.
The end really came at this event called the Frostbitten Convention, and yeah, the name is pretty fitting. The first time Congress offered a deal, Michigan rejected it. So the pro-statehood Democrats called a second convention in the dead of winter. The other party, the Whigs, mostly stayed home because of the freezing cold and because they were boycotting it. This allowed the Democrats to just push the deal right on through. It was a pretty slick political move, and it got its name from both the bitter cold and the chilly reception it got from a lot of people in Michigan.
So here's the final deal Congress came up with. Ohio got what it wanted all along, the Toledo Strip. In exchange, Michigan finally got to become a state, and as a sort of consolation prize, they were handed this vast, mineral-rich, but at the time, seemingly worthless wilderness of the western Upper Peninsula. As you can imagine, a lot of people in Michigan felt like they'd been completely robbed.
So why did Ohio win? I mean, really, why? It all came down to this one number, 21. That's how many electoral votes Ohio had. And Michigan? As a territory, it had 0. President Andrew Jackson and his party just couldn't risk angering a political powerhouse like Ohio, especially with an election coming up. In the end, politics, not the law, decided where that border was going to be.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question, right? Was this whole thing a fair compromise that cleverly avoided bloodshed? Or was it just a cynical power play? A case of the federal government essentially gerrymandering a border to keep a powerful political friend happy. You can definitely look back and see it as just another controversial chapter in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and it makes you wonder about the true cost of that frostbitten compromise.